稍后华尔街联报继续为大家带来过去24小时的最新消息。
观众朋友，大家好，欢迎收看今天的新风视线。据彭博新闻社报道，有几家台湾科技公司正在帮助华为在中国南部为一个不引人注意的芯片工厂建设基础设施。这种不寻常的合作有可能会激化台海矛盾。根据彭博新闻社的调查，这些公司包括台湾芯片材料公司、西科宏盛、崇越科技、亚翔工程等4家公司。由于台湾与大陆之间的紧张关系，台湾参与华为的努力可能会引发强烈抵制，而不稳定的台海关系是台湾明年1月总统选举的一个关键问题。台湾经济部部长王美花周三表示，他已经同意对这种不寻常的关系展开调查。台湾立法会议员要求在1个月内提供有关调查的初步报告。经济部官员表示，将主要调查这些公司是否在台北批准的申请范围内在中国大陆开展业务。反对人士担心，这些在台湾公司帮助下建造的华为工厂所生产的芯片，最终可能用于中国针对台湾的行动。如果蔡英文政府不加强对本土企业支持华为的控制，那么它就不是认真对待台湾的国防。华为可以说最近在各个方面都处于风口浪尖。华为8月下旬推出一款采用先进中国制造芯片的智能手机后，也引起了华盛顿的警惕，并且呼吁彻底切断华为与芯片制造商中芯国际的联系。现在华为的一举一动都会引起激烈争论，连五眼情报组织也坚称华为 5G 技术存在巨大的情报风险。华为当然是否认这一指控。5G 技术的出现可以说导致了国家之间正式的秘密战争，它甚至被纳入军情六处的报告中，并称中国将最终凭借这项技术接管世界的领导地位。全世界的官员都非常关心 5G， 并且与中国进行各种对抗，但实际上对 5G 技术发展的细节我们知之甚少。华为是如何达到今天的技术实力，令西方国家如此警惕的呢？这背后华为要感激一个土耳其人。在2018年，任正非在深圳举办了一场非凡的仪式，他邀请了一位土耳其科学家来到深圳的会议中心，并向他颁发了金质奖章，以表彰他对通信技术发展的杰出贡献。这个人就是被称为极化码之父的阿里坎。极化码是一种新型的编码方式，已经被列入 5G 移动通信的控制信道编码，这是信道编码领域近年来的重大突破。在华为准备的仪式中，伴随着莫扎特的土耳其进行曲，大家热烈庆祝阿里坎教授的到来。任正非也亲自走上红毯迎接他。为什么要如此兴师动众呢？因为阿里坎解决了信息世界长达半个世纪的问题。阿里坎是一位幸运的科学家，他在2008年发表的极地码学术研究，在短短10年后就得到了实现。他原本并不认为实际应用会在短时间内实现。他在华为为他举行的仪式上说，对于科学家来说，没有什么比看到自己的想法变成现实是更大的回报了。华为也感谢阿里坎，因为正是他为华为在 5G 技术上提供了巨大的竞争优势。华为 CEO 郭平当时说，阿里坎不仅是土耳其的英雄，也是通信行业的英雄。他的发明和对电信业的改进将会重塑信息世界，也许将影响到下一个世纪。5G 的速度要比 4G 快100倍，每公里可以连接1000万台设备，其大容量可以使数字产业渗透到生活的方方面面。世界经济论坛和电子工程协会等国际组织指出， 5G 将会打开新应用的大门，提高机器人、物联网、机对机通信领域的效率。这种新的移动技术将会引发工业革命，因为有了 5G， 云计算、人工智能、工业物联网才可以瞬间连接一切，也就是说及时监控数据，并且在很短的时间内达到先进算法的分析。它带来的结果就是工厂可以最有效地利用资源和能源进行定制生产，而不会造成浪费。医院可以提供个性化的医疗服务，城市管理部门可以及时控制城市上层建筑和基础设施，可以预测电力、水和天然气网络的故障，可以及时改变红绿灯等待时间，优先考虑繁忙方向。而无人驾驶汽车、无人机和机器人等自主物体也可以因为即时数据的获得而更加安全、精确地移动。这也正是为什么华为在掌握了 5G 技术之后， 令西方世界如此警惕的原因。然而 5G 技术也有更高的要求，它需要更多的基站，更多的基站也就意味着更高的投资成本和更多的能源消耗。正是在这里，阿里坎发明的新编码方法极地码开始发挥作用。极地码不仅可以显著提高 5G 的通信性能，还可以通过降低编码复杂度来节省能源。那么现在美国限制华为使用 5G 技术，然而上个月华为以一款自己研发的 5G 手机卷土重来，在美国制裁的情况下意外重返 5G 市场，令人刮目相看。而在此期间，正值任正非的女儿孟晚舟担任华为轮值董事长。孟晚舟于今年4月1号出任华为轮值董事长，任期于本月10月1号结束。在过去的6个月中，孟晚舟监督了华为新手机的推出，并且进行了多次高调演讲。分析人士认为，他巩固了任正非接班人的地位。华为的新款智能手机有什么意义呢？金融时报分析认为，这表明习近平一如既往地致力于自给自足，并将西方芯片制造商挤出中国市场。北京自2014年推出首个大型半导体补贴基金以来，用国产零部件替代进口芯片一直是中国的既定目标。然而到目前为止，在中国销售的大多数手机，甚至是 OPPO 和小米等本土品牌，内部都装满了外国制造的芯片。华为的新手机 Mate 60 Pro 则是不同，它可能是有史以来最中国的智能手机。除了手机的主要7纳米处理器之外，手机中的许多辅助芯片也都是国产的，包括蓝牙、WiFi 和电源管理芯片。9月25号，华为在深圳举办最新产品发布会。发布会上，华为避免谈论 Mate 60，但是展示了平板电脑和其他设备，并且誓言要提高智能手机产量，以满足不断增长的需求。与美国的紧张关系也激发了国内对这些设备的热情。近日，在上海的一家华为专卖店，一位一直在使用 iPhone 的消费者表示，想换成华为手机，以此支持中国的自制品牌。而随着华为新手机的上架，北京也同时宣布设立一项400亿美元的新基金，继续向国内芯片制造商提供补贴。北京似乎还帮助解决针对华为的主要竞争对手苹果。华为手机发布之际，有报道称中国政府机构和国有企业不鼓励员工购买苹果手机。而美国的半导体行业也越来越反对华盛顿的种种限制。就在今年7月，美国半导体行业的各大首席执行官们还前往华盛顿，共同表态反对对中国实施新的限制。因为随着美国的芯片被中国本地的版本所取代，他们的市场份额将受到严重威胁。经过多年的升级，中美之间的芯片冲突已经到了关键时刻。今年秋天，拜登政府预计将会最终确定出口管制，并且扩大限制中国客户获得美国技术的范围。彭博社指出，最终这场斗争将不是关于智能手机，而是关于人工智能和超级计算等具有战略意义的重要应用，包括军事技术。荣鼎集团的咨询总监则表示，如果华为可以获得高端芯片，那么这些芯片还会去哪里呢？为了摆脱美国的限制，习近平将不得不维持对国内半导体行业极其昂贵的投资，而且没有明确的结束日期。中国政府制定了2014年至2030年间在国内半导体行业投资超过1500亿美元的计划，目标是生产智能手机、汽车、电脑和其他产品所需的70%的芯片。但是随着现在中国经济陷入困境，这一承诺看起来越来越具有难度。房地产危机将在未来几年内挤压各级政府，限制他们的资源使用。以上就是今天新风视线的全部内容，感谢您的收看。这里是华尔街电视，如果喜欢记得点赞并且订阅我们的频道。我们下期节目再见。
We already knew Huawei's Silicon design arm was very capable of designing advanced chips, especially for smartphones. The main question is where Huawei would be able to fabricate such chips, since the specific rules on Huawei's Entity List designation came into effect in late 2020. The Entity List provisions for Huawei make it illegal to serve Huawei without a license while using American equipment. SMIC, Semiconductor Manufacturing International Corporation, the Chinese company that made the 7nm chip for Huawei, is highly likely to be using American equipment without such a license, so is likely to be in violation of American export controls. Even the electronic design automation (EDA) Huawei used, the software used to design chips, is highly likely to include American EDA tools, though it has long been recognized that this software was the weak link in export controls due to the potential for piracy and hacking. Analyze whether U.S. efforts to restrict investment in and export of advanced chips to China have accelerated the country's indigenous developments of semiconductor self-sufficiency. One major concern has been that American export controls would accelerate the key inputs that the U.S. government is trying to use as choke points, EDA tools and capital equipment. On the EDA side, there are emerging Chinese competitors. However, they have little market presence outside of China, and there are structural constraints to these firms becoming peer competitors to the Big Three, Cadence, Synopsys, and Siemens/Mentor Graphics. The primary constraint is that when foundries roll out their leading-edge processes, they work with the Big Three to ensure the smoothness of the design-to-manufacturing interface. This interaction gives the EDA tool vendors a competitive advantage. The foundries are unlikely to bring in other EDA vendors to work at this key interface if these vendors are not already major international vendors offering complete design flow software operating near the international technology frontier. The Chinese EDA vendors do not fit these criteria. For capital equipment, Chinese vendors have made progress in equipment for assembly and testing, although that equipment was not the main focus of the choke points. The main focus was fabrication capital equipment. Here progress has been much more limited, especially at advanced manufacturing nodes. The four most important types of equipment for fabrication are lithography, deposition, etching, and process control, inspection and metrology equipment. Lithography equipment that uses light and direct beams to pattern circuitry onto wafers, is dominated by the Netherlands ASML with some minor Japanese competitors. China already cannot purchase the most advanced equipment, extreme ultraviolet (EUV) lithography equipment, and from September 2023 onwards cannot purchase ASML's second most advanced equipment, argon fluoride immersion (ARFI) deep ultraviolet (DUV) equipment. China's Shanghai Microelectronics Equipment (SME) has yet to launch any fab-ready equipment despite years of hype, though there is talk yet again that SME will launch lithography equipment suitable for 28 nanometers processes this autumn. Even if SME pulls off this feat, it will still be far behind the technology frontier. In deposition, adding thin layers of materials and then energy to induce a chemical reaction, there are at least 5 Chinese producers reportedly undertaking mass production of equipment: Piotech, Nora, AMEC, ACMR, and Wanya. Nora and Piotech are the main vendors by market share. Overall, the local vendors have seized market share, going from 8.5% of domestic Chinese foundry purchases in 2020 to 25% in the first 10 months of 2022. However, Chinese producers are still mainly increasing market share in trailing edge and non-critical processes. In critical and leading-edge applications, such as advanced epitaxial and atomic layer deposition (ALD), Chinese producers haven't made much progress at all. Deposition steps are used more frequently in advanced manufacturing nodes because both the smaller lithography line widths and 3D chip architectures require greater amounts of deposition. Consequently, there has been an increase in demand for deposition equipment. This increased use of deposition in leading-edge processes actually advantages the foreign incumbents in the global market because most of the leading-edge process capacity is offshore thanks to export controls, and foreign producers will be unlikely to commit to using Chinese equipment for critical tasks for both business and geopolitical reasons. Etching, selective removal of materials that have been deposited on the wafer, equipment is dominated by LAM Research, a U.S. firm, followed by Japan's Tokyo Electron and the United States Applied Materials, and technology trends are playing into their dominance. As the technology frontier for fabrication nodes has advanced from 14/16 nanometer to 5 nanometers in logic and from 64L, L stands for layers, to 192L in NAND, the market for etching equipment has doubled. Thus, there is a similar advantage for incumbents with established leading-edge customers to that seen in deposition. The Chinese firms tend to do better at trailing or even just mature, e.g., 28 nanometers, nodes where etching equipment is used less frequently and thus there is lower demand. Nora and AMEC both have entered this market. AMEC offers conductor and dielectric etching equipment at 28 nanometers for non-critical and semi-critical processes and non-critical equipment at 5 nanometers. NORA just offers non-critical and semi-critical equipment at 28 nanometers for conductor etching. Process control equipment is almost all critical equipment because this equipment directly impacts the yield rates of fabrication. Thus, purchasers of such equipment are very circumspect about trying and proven newcomers. This area is also one with among the highest technical barriers to entry. And there is a new incumbent advantage in this sector, as data analytics using data gathered from existing operating machines has become increasingly important to advances in this equipment segment. Given these factors, it is no surprise that, like with lithography, Chinese vendors have made very little progress beyond those simple tasks where the barriers are not high, e.g., inspecting wafers prior to the fabrication process. Given the lack of progress at advanced nodes, it is not surprising that SMIC's advanced fab is chock-a-block full of American equipment often obtained in legally dubious ways, as well as Dutch advanced DUV and Japanese equipment obtained before the start of their respective governments' export controls. Identify the key strengths and weaknesses in the China-US contest for silicon supremacy. China's key strengths are its large market demand for chips, its large number of trained engineers in chip design and logic process technology, and government support. China's industrial weaknesses are the key inputs, EDA, and especially capital equipment. Government support is also a double-edged sword as it has encouraged excessive government intervention in management of firms and allocated capital based on metrics other than performance. The U.S. has a deep bench of firms in chip design, e.g., NVIDIA, fabrication, e.g., Intel, and key inputs. However, more than 2 decades of relative government neglect compared to the proactive policies of China, South Korea, and Taiwan have led some of America's deep capabilities to atrophy. Moreover, such neglect has been part of the reason chips have not been viewed as a growth industry by young people, with many more technically minded young people going into software. The CHIPS Act is the start for rectifying this policy neglect. The U.S. needs to address the issue of how to finance chip industry innovation beyond the 5-year timeframe of the CHIPS Act. American venture capital is not interested because of the high upfront costs and low probability of power law returns. America does not have the prodigious amount of patient capital of South Korea or, albeit much more inefficiently, China. How might China's current economic malaise impact the country's advancements in semiconductor development? The Chinese government has already seen lower take-up from regional/local governments in the third tranche of the big fund rolled out this year. This lack of enthusiasm suggests that local government debt is beginning to affect an area of great strategic interest to the Chinese state that appeared walled off from any government austerity in the short to medium term. I still think the central government will find the means to fully fund the relatively modest sums needed for the trimmed-down third tranche of the big fund, but longer term, the Chinese state will face more and more hard choices between funding industrial policies extravagantly and other core missions of China, such as big budget items like internal security and the military. Assess the impact of China-US chip competition on global supply chains and market share. The revelations emerging from SMIC's fabrication of Huawei's Mate 60 Pro chip show the U.S. has pursued licensing very loosely when it comes to SMIC. In her recent testimony to Congress, U.S. Commerce Secretary Gina Raimondo said that her department would close any loopholes they found. If such measures are taken and no further advanced DUV technology goes to China, China's ability to increase capacity at advanced nodes will be limited. China might face a Galapagos effect in which Chinese equipment suppliers can supply China's maturing fabs while the international market marches ahead with non-Chinese suppliers firmly entrenched. China is hoping to expand rapidly in mature nodes, such as 28 nanometers, because a lot of emerging areas of demand, such as chips for electric vehicles, are at these nodes. Unfortunately for China, Europe and Japan seem very reluctant to accede their automotive industries to China, and the US already has tariffs. Beyond the automotive industry, the appetite of the large foreign markets to accept a flood of Chinese chips at mature nodes is also quite limited given changing geopolitical attitudes.
absolutely important to understand China, and it's important to engage with China, and it's really important that I, as the Foreign Secretary of the UK and the other ministers in my department, and indeed other ministers across government, meet with Chinese ministers and Chinese officials, because pretending that China is not a significant player on the world stage is not a winning strategy. And one of the points I've tried to get across, and sometimes people don't, some of my dear friends, I don't think kind of really hear me when I'm saying this, is that engagement with another country is not a prize for good behaviour. It's not some kind of gift or reward. It is work. It's the work that we do. It's the work that we have got to do, and it's the work that we will continue to do. So engaging and understanding, I think, is incredibly important when it comes to foreign policy. Yeah.
And so just on that, in the updated integrated review from earlier this year, the government pledged to double funding for China capabilities across government. So do you know where that money is going at the moment, or if it hasn't been delegated yet, what is on your wish list?
Well, I mean, some of it is about skills, making sure that we have people that speak Mandarin, people that have a proper understanding of China in all its complexities. Some of it is about headcount. Some of it's about having more people. Some of it is about having more points of presence and better points of presence. So some of that will be money spent in China in our network. We have a number of points of presence around China, not just in Beijing. And it won't just be, of course, within the FCDO. It will be in a number of areas across government. So we're all going to have to bid for that extra money. I'd like to think that because it is a pot of money focused on another country, that I'd have a half decent chance of getting at least a decent chunk of that money. But we're going to have to bid. It's going to be competitive, and I think that's good.
And what's the timeline for that?
Well, I think some of that will be dictated by circumstances. One of the lessons that I took, having been a minister in the department, is very little in foreign affairs happens quickly. Developing a cohort of people that have really strong language skills is not an instant fix. So we are going to have a degree of patience about this. And I've often said you can spend money quickly or you can spend money well. And spending money both quickly and well is really quite tough, and I want to make sure that we spend it very well.
Does that also include people that you've called your dear friends, people in the parliamentary party of the Conservatives, who may not understand China as much as they possibly should? Is there going to be more training for those, or do you think that they need to understand China more? Maybe they do. You do think that they understand China enough?
Well, I'm not. I think it would be a bit arrogant of me to say they don't understand China. I think they a number of people. I mean, people that I describe as dear friends. When I was being invited to criticise people who had been critical of me, I made the point that some of the very passionate critics of the decisions that I've made about how we work with China are people who are sanctioned by the Chinese government, and therefore have legitimate reason to be really very frustrated with the behaviour of the Chinese government. And I'm not going to criticise them for responding to being sanctioned in that way. Now, I need to make the case, and I will continue to do so. They have every right. We live in a democratic model where we can have friendly but impassioned disagreement about policy issues, and some of my closest friends in politics disagree with me on some of the direction of travel that I've been taking. I will always listen to them. I will always try and address their concerns as far as I can. I'm not going to start sticking the boot in. But yeah, I want to make sure that right across the system. Oh, please tell me I'm not the only one that can see that happening.
That's not. Sorry, guys. That's CCP controlled.
Right. Okay. So yeah, I want to make sure that we have a proper, clear-eyed, and well-informed debate about how we work, how we engage with, how we trade with, what we choose to do, and what we choose not to do with China.
Now, your trip to China earlier this year was one of those things that was a little bit controversial.
Well, I'm going to pull you up on that. Foreign secretary flies to foreign country to have meetings should not be controversial.
I would agree with you on that, and yet it was. So why do you think that is?
Well, because it's China, and as I say, there have been a number of things that China has done, both domestically, regionally, internationally, and directly to some of my parliamentary colleagues, which has angered a lot of people. I think there's there's huge legitimacy towards that anger, but it's my job. It is my job to have meetings like this, to have trips like this, to have those difficult conversations where we need to have difficult conversations face to face and be very, very clear-eyed about those conversations. I think that I sometimes fear that we've drifted towards a very binary set of habits. And again, that's reflected. I keep being invited. What one word would you use to describe China? And I'm like, well, I don't do that to any other country in the world. No one invites me to say, give me one word to describe your UK's relationship with France. I mean, it's just, and it's weird. Our relationship with China, just like our relationship with every other country around the world, it's complicated, it's multifaceted. There are things that countries do that we agree with and seek to support. There are, even with our closest friends, there are things that they do that we might disagree with, and we raise those issues with them. So the idea of giving this one word to descriptor to China, where we don't do it with any other country in the world, I think is foolish.
Now, you say that you raised some of these tough issues with China when you were there. I think some people are skeptical of how much the Chinese listen or care about you raising that kind of stuff. So in those tough conversations then, I mean, what do the Chinese say? Like, what does Foreign Minister Wang Yi say in response to that? How does he react?
So this is, I think, again, I'll give your listeners a little bit of a kind of a peek behind the curtain on how these things work. Often what people say in the room is not the most important thing to take note of. Often the things that they don't say, or how they say it, or the tone of their response, it's that subtleties which, again, why face-to-face meetings is so very, very important. So, for example, when you have a meeting, a bilateral meeting, you'll have the two principals who do all the talking. Then in the room, there may be up to a dozen other people. Especially
for the Chinese side.
Yeah, who take copious notes and look very, very carefully. And what my officials are doing is, whilst I'm talking with Foreign Minister Wang Yi, for example, they will be watching how his officials respond to some of the things I say, what their body language says, what things they write frantically, which bits they ignore, which bits that they overlook, which bits does the Foreign Minister listen to carefully, how long he pauses before he answers, whether his answers are the kind of the pretty much pre-scripted responses to things. For example, when I raised the treatment of the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang, I know exactly what he's going to say because he's said it before. But does he drift off script slightly, or does he stay religiously to the script? Does he say it and say it and say it again, or does he kind of skip past it? These are the kind of things. So certain things I did really very much notice when we spoke. When I talked about China's commercial relationship with the rest of the world, and how many countries, including our own, including the UK, are taking measures to safeguard themselves. And that is having a slowing effect on trade volumes. And I made the point that whether it's the Philippines, who I visited just before going to Beijing, or the UK, or the US, or Australia, or others, we are all taking measures which are just nudging down our trade volumes with China. And the cumulative effect is having a real impact on China. And when I had that discussion, he listened very, very closely. His officials were looking very intently. When I had the conversation about Prigozhin's attempted coup in Russia and how cracks are appearing, and the longer this war goes on, the more likely there is of some unpredictable, catastrophic event in Russia, which would be bad news for the UK, bad news for Europe, but particularly bad news for a country like China, which has a land border, extensive land border with Russia. Again, listen very, very carefully when we discussed that. Now, his response was identical to responses I've had from him previously, except it wasn't. And it's those differences mean that these messages are landing, and we do have influence. It's not instant, and it might not even be massive, but we do have influence. And I get very frustrated with my colleagues basically saying, oh, the Chinese don't care what the British think. They really do. Otherwise, I wouldn't have had a 4-hour meeting with their foreign minister.
But would you have liked that meeting to have been longer? I mean, it's a shame it was only one day.
Well, there are a couple of things. There are a couple of points that I really needed to land, and negotiating the logistics of a trip like this are always long and complicated. It's not just a matter of picking up the phone saying, "Are you available on this date?" There's a whole load of things, particularly in the Chinese system. Well, exactly about just simple things like your minister can come, but he has to travel in a Chinese government car, and I'm like, no, I will travel with the ambassador in our car, and so there's loads of things like that. And of course, the original timescale for the meeting was meant to be earlier in the summer, but my then opposite number became
not so opposite.
First of all, he was unwell, and then he was invisible, and no one's seen him. I mean, no one's seen him since the summer, so that kind of delayed things. And then we drifted into multilateral season. You got UNGA, you got NATO foreign ministers, G7 foreign ministers. So there was a bit of a window, and so I would prefer to have a short trip than no trip.
How much were you brought in on that delay when Qin Gang first started? Well, I think it was a EU meeting that he first cancelled on in July. Were the Chinese telling you that he was just ill for a little bit?
Yeah, so look, the public explanation echoed what we were hearing directly, which was, they were still very, very much keen for the visit to happen, but unfortunately the foreign minister was temporarily unavailable, and then that temporary became slightly less temporary, and then he had to stand down from his post, and then Wang Yi was stepped back in as foreign minister. So, their public message was the message that we received, of course, just like their public messaging. I think a lot of people are like, that sounds unusual. Sadly, it's interestingly, it's not the only time it's happened. Obviously, with the defence minister also taking ill, and then
Rocket Force generals, the CEO of Evergrande this week.
Yeah.
James, a slightly different question here. You've been known to sing karaoke with diplomats after some meetings. Antony Blinken, I think you did a Beatles with.
Yeah. Yes.
Oops. Someone's very excited about Antony Blinken doing Beatles.
Yeah. So Tony Blinken, fantastic guitarist, and so was the then foreign minister, Japanese foreign minister Hayashi.
Do you think you could see yourself doing that with the Chinese?
Not just yet. Look, one of the points I made in my Mansion House speech was that I do this job to try and influence other governments.
But they don't open up, do they? Chinese diplomats are famously very disciplined. I mean, I hear what you're saying about the body language that they might be letting off, but they're famously disciplined for staying on message. They don't tend to listen really that much. They certainly don't personally have any lunches or engagements and that kind of stuff. That makes your job as a diplomat very hard to build that rapport, doesn't it?
Yeah, but everyone's human. And look, one of the things that I would say, and I'm very, very conscious that this is on a whole upper level of arrogance, what I'm about to say. But I do always caution people kind of buying into the kind of narrative about how China is and how Chinese officials, because the Chinese government would like nothing more for the whole world to basically say, oh, Chinese diplomats are famously disciplined and give nothing away and that kind of stuff. But you know what? If if I use the poker face thing. If you've never played a hand of poker, everybody looks poker faced, but good poker players can spot
the tells,
the really subtle. And I have some fantastic poker players on my payroll. I have people who have engaged with China for decades. I have people in our various posts in China who are on their second, third, fourth tour as diplomats in China, speak Chinese like native speakers, and track longitudinally,
changes.
Those subtle changes, because nobody has a perfect poker face, and that's why having a diplomatic network matters. That's why having experts in the language, culture, and society in China matters, because that's how you tell the difference. If all you do is read the official statement of the meeting, it looks repetitive. But as I say, when you're in the room, and I've noticed it, the first conversation I had with Wang Yi in the margins of the UN General Assembly in September of last year. If you look at the readout of the conversation, my words to him, his words to me, and then the readout of the conversation that we had nearly a year later, you would look at that and go, what was the point? Nothing has changed. But it's all the little subtle differences. It's with how much passion he put forward the Chinese position on various things compared with how much time he spent discussing those issues versus other issues.
Can you give us one example of what do you think has changed between September of last year and your conversation with
him?
July
The Chinese economic slowdown, the public failure of zero COVID policy.
You think they're more humble?
The Chinese, well, I mean, they'd never say that, but the Chinese people's reaction, when basically the Chinese people turned around to their government and said, no, we've had enough. You must change your position. And then the Chinese government changed its position. Youth unemployment, I think they stopped publishing the figures at 21%. Our estimates is that it's comfortably over 25%. There are probably, and I might trip myself up on the numbers here, there are probably more newly built vacant properties in China than the total number of properties in the UK.
I think it's the total number of people in the UK.
Yeah, yeah. So there are more newly built vacant properties than the population of the UK. Like, that focuses the mind. And when a British foreign secretary basically says, you need to do things differently, otherwise you will see international trade subtly, gently trending away from you, just at a point where to maintain the growth projections that China needs to fund its contract with its own society, it needs nearly double-digit annual growth. And it ain't going to get it unless it does something differently.
Now, the government's current approach, I think it can be summed up as robust pragmatism. Is that fair to say? I mean, it's no longer the golden era. So can I ask you, when it comes to things like investment, Chinese investment, which is one of the purposes of your visit, in what areas are we robust on? What are the red lines for Chinese investment into the UK or trade with the UK? Because to your critics, it doesn't sound like there's much that's that different.
So the trip was not about trade. I know that there's some kind of post-hoc. I mean, it's one of these things where, and again, I think there needs to be a bit of a re-education. I have to be careful with using the word re-education. I think there needs to be a bit of a reminder of what diplomacy is about. It's not always immediately transactional. And I kept saying to people, they said, "Oh, you're going over to China to talk about trade." I'm like, no, I'm going over to China to talk about a whole load of stuff. And they're like, "Oh, so what are you hoping to achieve? You can I come back with a trade?"
In general, what are the trade investment red lines?
So the trip was not necessarily about trade investment, but I mean, we've set this out, and again, remind my hosts when I was in Beijing of this. I set this out pretty explicitly in the Mansion House speech that I gave around Easter, which is, of course, we will trade with China. Of course, we will have investment from China, but we do so with our eyes wide open, and we, like many other countries around the world, are now putting a greater priority on our security and protections against inappropriate Chinese either diplomatic or industrial behaviour. We are prioritising that above the commercial. So where security considerations and commercial considerations clash, security considerations always win. And so the exact red lines will be dependent on the exact circumstance, but as a policy, a conscious policy decision now, we are prioritising security.
Mm-hmm. Now, I think it's fair to say that your Mansion House speech and the government's approach to China is quite different to the last Conservative government's approach to China under Liz Truss just a year ago. Did you change your view on China during that time because you were one of Liz Truss's key backers, or did you always disagree with her on China?
So look, even close friends, political allies don't agree on absolutely everything. Now
but she put you in charge as Foreign Secretary. You guys must have been relatively aligned.
And she put me in charge as Foreign Secretary when she became Prime Minister, and of course the Foreign Secretary has an input on foreign policy, the primary input on foreign policy, but all big ticket policy is really decided cross government, and the ultimate arbiter is going to be the Prime Minister. And look, I would have made the case that being vocal in our criticism of China, or describing China in a certain way, if that's the decision that she wanted to take as Prime Minister, I respect that. But that we also had to make sure that we were taking practical measures. And so sometimes when people say, "Oh, our position has softened on China," and I said, "Well, give me an example," because actually we have toughened our stance. As I say, we have toughened our stance on investment from China. We have toughened our protections of freedom of speech and freedom of liberty on university campuses, for example. We have taken practical measures to protect ourselves against all forms of foreign interference. So the practical measures we have toughened up. And if people assume that being less confrontational publicly is a softening of position, they are missing the areas where they should focus on.
I'll give you one example where it does seem like there has been a softening from both Rishi Sunak and Liz Truss's pledges, which is to shut down Confucius Institutes in the UK. Now, there are 30 of these, and earlier this year the government says that it wasn't going to do that anymore.
So that is based on our assessment of risk. We, of course, take as a freedom of speech and people's individual freedoms. I mean, we had an assessment, for example, of the so-called Chinese police stations, both here in Manchester, in London, and elsewhere. We have made it very, very clear to the Chinese government what we regard to be the boundaries of acceptable behaviour of their actions within the UK, and all governments have manifestations in other countries, whether it be embassies, whether it be for us, the British Council or whatever. And actually, protecting ourselves can sometimes mean shutting things down, absolutely. But you can also protect yourselves without having to shut things down. And for example, we need to look at the relative merits of losing, for example, the ability of the British Council to work in China or indeed other countries. The British Council, since its formation, has not just distributed British language learning. Embedded in that are British cultural norms and British philosophy and British thinking, as well as the British language, the English language. And being careful about losing that influence overseas is really, really key, and that's why it's nuanced. And sometimes you make an assessment about the relative merits of doing something, and sometimes the easy headline isn't always the right headline.
Now, in a recent interview, you said that your military background has trained you to make decisions as far ahead as possible. That's a direct quote from you. In that case, I wondered, what's your thinking of what to do if early one morning you're woken up with a phone call, Foreign Secretary, China has invaded Taiwan?
So look, if I get that phone call, of course, we do thinking about this. You will understand that what I'm not going to do on your podcast, as much as I respect you and I would love to I would love to make sure that you get good listener figures for this particular episode. I am not going to start talking through the contingency planning that we have for a whole range of eventualities. But I would have regarded that as a massive failure of foreign policy because, and again, I have said this multiple times and directly to the Chinese government. Disruption across the Taiwan Strait is everybody's business. And inevitably the Chinese government will say, well, no, this is an entirely domestic matter. You know, we don't mess around in your domestic decision making. But this is an entirely domestic matter. It's nothing to do with you. And I say, no, this is not an entirely domestic matter. Huge international trade volumes go through that body of water. The disruption to the movement of key componentry, key bits of the componentry of modern life go through that stretch of water. It would be a catastrophically bad thing for the global economy, and it would be a catastrophically bad thing for the Chinese economy. It would collapse the Chinese economy. As we're now seeing, the Chinese economy is not all-powerful. Their economic dominance, as I said in my Mansion House speech in Easter, is not inevitable. And conflict across the Taiwan Strait would, I think, collapse the Chinese economy and bring a number of other economies down with it. And so it is not in China's interest for that to happen. And this is about diplomacy. Diplomacy and foreign affairs is not just about reacting to events. It's about steering events. We're not just blown around by the winds of circumstance. We make the weather, and preventing that outcome from happening is an absolute core plank of UK's foreign policy in the Pacific and the Indo-Pacific region.
And the final question for me, which is that, Foreign Secretary, you've got a great Instagram game. I really enjoy it. Your colleague Grant Shapps is very prolific on TikTok. Do you think you'll go on TikTok anytime soon?
No.
Anyone have any audience questions? Yeah, I think we only take two. So is there a microphone coming from the back there? Yeah. Yeah, so we've got Latika there, and then, yeah, we've got Hillary, sorry, the woman in white here as well.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Secretary of State Latika Burke from the Sydney Morning Herald, great to see you. One of the fashionable words that's become, I guess, the word is, the buzzword now is de-risking. Yeah. Is this an approach that the UK is following? And if so, what specific sectors do we see de-risking taking place?
Great, and can we just move the microphone to opposite, and then we can deal with both, and then we'll let you go.
Thank you, Cindy. So I just wanted to see what's the realistic chance to reassume the Sino-UK economic financial dialogue, asking as the UK pension industry has a lot of investments and exposure to Chinese market. You've mentioned that, the economy is not doing great. So do we demand a level of dialogue and transparency from the Chinese market?
Look, thank you on both questions. Yeah, I think it was Ursula von der Leyen who coined the phrase, or coined the word de-risking. And so she was speaking in her capacity pan-EU member states. But I do think in various ways, pretty much all countries are doing some form of de-risking. Now, the exact definition, I mean, she used it, and we now kind of tend to use it as an umbrella term for a whole load of things about domestic protection, some of which I've already discussed. Some of it's about diversification of supply chains. Some of it is about making sure that we don't allow kind of pinch points. And de-risking doesn't just have to happen in a bilateral relationship. So, for example, and I've had this conversation with African leaders, at the moment, critical minerals are buried in the ground in many, many, many parts of the world. But the processing of those critical minerals is disproportionately happening in China, which potentially gives China, creates a pinch point, and pinch points can turn into strangleholds. So I think it's in everybody's interest to actually diversify, not necessarily all just where we buy componentry from, but where that processing happens. And I said when I said this to a number of African leaders, Africa has seen its raw commodities exported, whether it's cocoa, whether it's coffee, a whole load of things exported raw, processed and value added outside the continent, and then they've had to buy it back in at a premium, which has had a disastrous long-term effect on African economies. And I said, look, you've had it with cocoa, you've had it with coffee, don't do it with lithium, don't do it with copper, do more processing domestically. Now, there is a massive chunk of self-interest in that because it prevents that pinch point stranglehold risk, but it also helps us stop the boats. Because guess what? If we can lift those African economies, poor Africans are going to be less desirous to try and cross the across the Mediterranean and cross the Channel and come to the UK. So it's a kind of general win-win. So we're all doing it in various forms, and I think it's probably going to be a trend that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. With regard to the dialogue, as I say, we do need to have regular dialogue with China. A lot of UK investment in China, whether it's traditional investment or UK companies having an active economic presence in China, and it matters that we get that right. I think regular dialogue helps. How formalised we make that, we will have to see. That's one of the things that are up for debate. I've said it's in China's interest to get into the habit of being more transparent on some of its economic stuff, on some of its military decision making. Transparency prevents. No, that's not true. Transparency reduces the risks of miscalculations and errors, whether that be in the commercial sphere, diplomatic sphere, or military sphere. So it's in China's interest to be more open. It is not instinctively where they are. But again, you change behaviour by understanding the motivations of your counterparty. And so China recognises it needs to do something different economically. It can't continue doing what it's doing because otherwise it will continue seeing slide. That is an opportunity for influence, and I think it's one that we should take.
Foreign Secretary, thank you so much.
Thank you. Cheers, everyone.
Sophia and Sam, I thought first of all I could get you guys to reflect on the themes of that discussion. What did you think of what James Cleverly had to say? Sophia, maybe you can start.
I think the Foreign Secretary is obviously treading a similar line to the Mansion House speech, which was extraordinary in its numerous audiences. And I think we're in quite an unusual situation now with foreign policy, where we have this foreign policy campaigning infrastructure in Parliament, particularly on the issue of China, which is not something that we historically had before. So it means that the Foreign Secretary is not just having to speak to the Chinese regime, our partners and allies, the British people, British business, but he's also having to speak to Westminster and the different dynamics going on there. And there's obviously an extremely vociferous sort of cell within Westminster who have very strong views about China. So the sort of diplomacy at home is as important as the diplomacy abroad on this issue. I think certainly...
or even inside the Conservative Party alone.
Well, exactly. And, we don't hear a huge amount from Labour on China. We're still waiting to see more of the bones on what they're going to be putting forward. But certainly within the Conservative Party, there has been a ferocious debate. I think it's interesting to hear the Foreign Secretary, and I agree with him, make that point that where a lot of the shifts, the perceived shifts have been, and that softening is really around the public rhetoric. And I think there is a credible argument to say that if you are softening some of that rhetoric, which, by the way, is something that we're seeing, in Canberra, in DC, amongst many of our partners and allies, that actually also allows you to have some kind of greater room for that really, really fundamental security project, which is what we need to do, because everything is about swinging that pendulum and making sure that we have the right balance from which we can actually engage. We want to be engaging from a confident position with all those security measures in place, but we won't be able to engage if we're just sort of, if we've got things too heavily stacked on one side rather than the other. So, and we hear a bit of that in what he's saying about Confucius Institutes. The cost assessment there is to say that the value value of the British Council being able to operate is more significant to us and our interests, and I should say our allied interests as well, that's not just about the UK, than closing down these Confucius Institutes, which have been judged to be relatively not particularly efficacious. So, and I think that is a really interesting balance that they're having to strike there. I mean, I agree with him that you don't want to be fighting the battle in the public rhetoric, you want to be fighting the battle behind the scenes. But of course, because of how sensitive the security dimensions of our relationship with China are, it's often very opaque and it's hard to get officials to speak publicly about all those measures that have been put in place behind the scenes. So I do sort of understand why there is that concern and consternation within Westminster, because there isn't necessarily visibility of everything the government is doing.
I thought it was really interesting what he was saying about the body language of the Chinese, that they're always observing that. As someone who was wanted to be a diplomat once in my life, one time, that kind of colour was really interesting. Sam, what did you make of it?
Well, first of all, let me say that I was twice rejected from the Foreign Office as well. So I share shattered dreams too. I think the view that I have of it is it's good to see the Foreign Secretary talk about these things and add that level of complexity to it. You talk about the body language stuff. I cover how the UK talks about China every single week. I've done for 3 years now. If an MP or a peer has used the word China in Parliament, I have read that word. It's a sad life that I live. And I have to say that the conversation there is on a level that is not often expressed in Westminster. So there's a bit of a vacuum around how do we deal with China in Westminster that's filled by people who have a very strong opinion, which is absolutely fundamental to democracy, but often there's just one set of opinions one reads in the public domain, in the political domain. It actually surprised me that he was so frank about what he was looking to achieve from those one-on-one meetings with various people. And I wish that there was more of a culture of explaining that, as it were. What's the purpose of what we're doing? I think one of the things the government is particularly poor at is communicating what it's actually trying to achieve. And all the Foreign Secretary is all fine to report back to his Mansion House speech, but the idea of protect, align, engage, I could have made that up on the spot. It's not going to be something that people understand straight away. So we need more confident messaging about what we're actually trying to achieve here. That would be my hot take.
And Sophia, how do you see the Conservative Party's, we just alluded to it here, own internal conflict on China, something that I think occasionally comes to the fore, but especially over the spy story in the last month or so? Where does that go from here? Is that productive in a China discussion?
I think there is a really important conversation to be had around parliamentary education and education more generally in Westminster. I was a little bit disappointed by the response about that Chinese capabilities uplift fund. I mean, to have that as a competitive tender across government just seems insane to me. And I'm also not clear that there are so many different aspects of our relationship with China that need to come into view. I mean, we've described China as a systemic challenge, but we've actually not implemented a whole of government system level.
Yeah, what does that actually mean?
Shift. Yeah. Senior officials working in DEFRA, for example, need to have China capabilities because, we need to be understanding our Chinese investors seeking to buy up productive agricultural land. There's so many different things outside of the national security wheelhouse in traditional sense that need to come into view. And I do think as well that just in general, the sort of parliamentary education around China is extremely poor. And there does seem to need to be some kind of process around this. We've lived with the threat of Russia from the sort of Cold War era. Institutionally, we're so comfortable at responding to that and kind of moving the system into gear. And of course, we saw that in the situation with the invasion of Ukraine and that pre-intelligence that we received in anticipation of that, and the system was able to mobilize in response. I still feel that we are really in a reactive phase with China. We are so much better than where we were. But for example, I think a lot of this is about conceptual shifts. We have this conversation about, does China care what Britain thinks or does, or, and all this very British tradition of talking ourselves down about, of course, we're just a sort of little minnow, and why would China be interested in us? We actually have some really distinct value offer to China, not least of all our position between the two major Western blocs that China is going to be seeking to divide. That's one of its core objectives over the next decade, is to drive a wedge between the EU and the United States and create kind of different spheres of influence there. The UK is uniquely placed within that construction, so even just on that alone. But we do have other sort of value adds, whether that's kind of in diplomacy. I mean, China looks to the UK for climate leadership, sort of policy incubation around this. We are often holding the pen in the international diplomatic community. All of these things have value to China, and we don't seem to be very adept at assessing that value and understanding that we actually will increase and develop and enhance our strategic influence by investing in those areas that are also of value to China, which is why when we have questions about rolling back net zero and so on, this is not just a domestic conversation. This is actually about our international influence, and not just with our partners, but also our strategic rivals too.
Now, Sam, in your work looking at what politicians are saying about China, do you feel like, Sophia used the word reactive there. It does sometimes feel like the government is being reactive to concerns that backbenchers bring on China. For example, cases like the British citizen Jimmy Lai, who owned a paper in Hong Kong, really had to see grassroots campaigning for the government to even mention him after the national security law has come into place. James Cleverly sounded very good here, all very smooth. But do you actually think that the government itself has that extensive view of our relationship with China? Sometimes it feels like they're being dragged into positions.
I think that's absolutely fair. I think one of the biggest weaknesses we have in our overall approach to China right now is a government that is constantly or appears to be dragged into acting on various things. I mean, we didn't raise it there with Cleverly, but one of the things that we could have touched on was the Manchester Consul General incident, where that Hong Konger was beaten. Eventually the diplomats left, but it wasn't a case of get out of country. It was more of like a back passage sort of diplomacy thing there. But I think it's a wider issue, which is that controversially, given that I'm on a panel with a journalist, I do think there is an issue we have in the ecosystem around understanding China, wherein journalists approach MPs for an on or off the record comment on a significant security issue or issue that the MP doesn't know anything about. So let me give you an example, right? Electric vehicles, we're going to have a conversation around where the UK's industrial strategy is on that, what the actual risks are, what the challenges are, what the opportunities are. I do not need to read what an MP thinks about that, fundamentally. I don't mean that in an insulting way. I need to read what an EV expert or potentially a series of EV experts say about it, and then I can read their insight and compare that to where the government is moving, and at that point, I can see an MP being like, brilliant, I can see the concerns here. So that ties back into your point. And there are exceptions to that rule. There are some MPs who are fantastic at raising things that the government is still incredibly weak on. Scan through the parliamentary records of someone like Catherine West, Labour's Shadow Minister for Asia, and you'll see repeated references to BGI Group, which is a huge Chinese genomics firm. Scan through Alicia Kern's stuff, you'll see references to Lodging, which is a Chinese system people use in ports. There are these cases that are brought forward, and the government is really bad at answering, but I do think we need to see more expert comment across the arena, as it were.
And Sam, just on that, Sophia raised the question of what is Labour's position on China? Well, what is Labour's position on China?
Yeah, so I have very little to add beyond what Sophia outlined there. All I would say, the two things that I am speaking to people about when it comes to Labour's position on China, the two things that are stated that are different. The first is that the Labour Party's official position, as of this moment, is that a genocide is taking place in Xinjiang, right? So let's say we sped race through an election and by this time next month, Labour are in power. Labour have an obligation to act if their official view is that a genocide is taking place. They have signed up. We have signed up as a country to the different conventions, etc., etc. That's the one thing. That's a very hefty thing. And the other thing is that Labour have discussed this idea of a UK-China audit. We're going to look at the bilateral. We're going to work out where our risk threshold is, etc., etc. That's the slogan. What lurks beneath that is yet to be seen, but worth keeping an eye on, I think.
And Sophia, rather predictably, he refused to answer my question about Taiwan and what the UK would do. But what do you think that the UK, what do you think would be in British interest to do if China were to invade Taiwan?
Well, there's so many dimensions to this, and I think also we focus very much on the kind of military scenarios there, but there are also a lot of kind of economic statecraft scenarios that need to be mapped as well, and in some ways they may actually be more likely to occur. look, there was obviously extensive wargaming that went on in Whitehall in the same way it went on in Canberra and DC late last year and early this year. It is something that there is a constant update of scenario planning within HMG. The UK has determined that there is a significant British interest in such a scenario. But of course, I think something that has sort of dawned on the government and many of our allies is that we are living in a very dynamic geopolitical environment that could theoretically give rise to multiple spheres of conflict simultaneously. And of course, in such a scenario, the UK would have to take decisions about its resources alongside our closest allies about whether or not we are needed shoring up the Euro-Atlantic security theatre as well as the Indo-Pacific security theatre. So I think for all these reasons, the shift of emphasis has moved to deterrence, which is where you have projects like AUKUS and so on, which are meant to sort of stave off these kind of eventualities occurring in the first place. But I do think that the UK's consciousness, its sort of awareness, heightened awareness of what's going on in the Indo-Pacific and has dramatically increased, and the sense that we have a direct stake in that, not that that is a higher interest, but that there is a national interest in that, that has been one of the biggest shifts that's taken place over the past year. AUKUS is a response to that, but the development of that thinking and it has been something that has been quite a slow process, but I'd say it's accelerated quite significantly in the past 2 years.
Now, I'd like to move on to some audience questions. So could you raise your hands if does anyone have any questions, just kick us off. Yeah.
James said
oh, sorry, could you just wait for the microphone? Sorry.
James said that you wouldn't try and summarize France in one word, but I think possibly you've got a candidate for China, which is nationalism, which is very extreme, it seems, and I'd be interested in anybody's views on that we have a sufficient appreciation of that, Parliament have a sufficient appreciation of that, and what it leads to, because we know that imperialism in Russia leads to Ukraine.
Interesting. Yeah, should we get to do that question first, and then?
I think that's a really great question. I think it ties into the fact that we have a serious lack of China capability stuff here. I can name honestly on 10 fingers how many people we have in the public political domain talking about China with a proper level of expertise. And what we've seen is that if you don't have the expertise, you can't assess the threat, the challenge, or the opportunity properly. Whether we understand China's nationalism in the media, which often informs the political debate, I would say probably not yet, although Chinese Whispers is doing a great job of getting us there. Good plug. But I do think it's a really critical thing, and it really worries me. I don't have any encouraging words to give you on that, apart from people I speak to are aware that is an issue.
I think you're right that nationalism does define modern China in the sense that communism no longer defines modern China. And it's interesting what manifestation that has on foreign policy, because as you say, imperialism has led to the Ukraine war. Nationalism, of course, could lead to an invasion of Taiwan, but I do think there's a real question of if Xi Jinping is about making China great again, to what extent does invading Taiwan actually make China great again? You know, I know in democratic countries we often talk about a dead cat strategy, distraction strategy from economic problems at home, but actually that particular distraction would make the problems at home so much worse. Almost all of China's maritime trade goes past Taiwan or American military bases in Okinawa in Japan. So, you know, Sophia, as you said, it's these economic statecraft methods that would really screw up China if the West decided to basically besiege China's seas as a response to Taiwan. And I think Beijing knows that. So yes, agreed, nationalism absolutely defines modern China, but I'm not sure it does necessitate an invasion of Taiwan myself. I don't know, Sophia, if you wanted to add anything to that.
Well, I think I agree with the Foreign Secretary that using one word, I mean, even nationalism, yes, it's an appropriate descriptor, but it's not sufficient because it does not necessarily indicate whether or not that will be accompanied by or would inevitably lead to a form of imperialism that would, you know, have profound geopolitical implications. I mean, I think, you know, it's also the case, that there will be nationalist forces affecting a very large number of countries, including many of our allies over the coming decades. So I'm not sure that it's a sufficient term to encapsulate the risk that we're facing here or the nature of it. But yes, I agree it is a huge problem and profoundly disturbing.
We had a question over here as well.
When we talk about relations with China, it seems to be focused on economy, whether they're going to be trading or not. One thing I think we forget to mention is the Chinese people or Taiwanese people. Do they want war? Ordinary Chinese people, Taiwanese people just want to get on with their lives, have the children to go to better schools, better jobs. No one wants war. And I was I wanted to ask the Foreign Secretary the question in terms of what would be government policy to prevent or help prevent war between these two places. Mm-hmm. Would Chinese people have a role to play? You know, the demonstration to end the zero COVID swiftly within weekend shows that although China may be autocracy, but Chinese people do have a voice. They could influence. Do we have a policy to engage with ordinary people there?
That's really interesting.
Well, the UK has not traditionally been extremely effective at engaging with diaspora communities in the UK or understanding the foreign policy implications for diaspora communities. There are several other countries that do it a lot better than the UK does, frankly. It's sort of interesting to me that in domestic terms, the UK has sort of now is setting up all these different units in the Home Office that's looking at state threats. So these are sort of, this is not the foreign policy people, these are the people who are sort of looking after the home front. So this is a domestic story, and state threats from countries like Iran and China and so on coming from the outside in. And that can involve transnational repression, interference in our democracy, parliament, all of these different areas. But that hasn't really been matched by investments in more positive and constructive engagement with diaspora communities and understanding that that has to be a piece of the puzzle when we are talking about a much more dynamic geopolitical environment. So I think we still have a huge way to go on that, and we have to be aware. I mean, I think obviously the situation with the BNOs in Hong Kong has sort of drawn some attention to that, but again, we're seeing that in sort of reactive kind of enforcement terms rather than thinking about what a proactive and positive engagement story looks like. And I think that also comes into the question about higher education and universities. You know, we need to have some space of allowing a positive cultural influence and exchange to be taking place, where, you know, Western values, culture and society can have positive influence in that respect. And I am concerned that while I think we do need to be a bit cynical and skeptical about our capacity to directly influence in those terms, particularly back in the Chinese domestic environment, we shouldn't be throwing the baby out with the bathwater on that, because there is some work there that does move the dial in small ways. And when we're looking at trying to reduce risks from really catastrophic scenarios, even those tiny little movings of the needle are incredibly important. So I don't actually know what the government strategy is in terms of trying to engage directly with the Chinese people. It seems quite opaque to me, and I'm not sure it's particularly sophisticated, but it's something that I think needs to be in the mix. And if you look back to, you know, the kinds of things we were doing in the Cold War, you know, this has always been a part of our statecraft. Perhaps we've become a bit more complacent about it.
I'm personally skeptical. I mean, I know the Foreign Secretary said that zero COVID ended because of the protests. I'm personally skeptical of that. I actually think that there were other factors at play where we could already see the Chinese state winding back zero COVID. I don't actually know if we have a good example of popular protests in China leading to political change, as depressing as that is. Having said that, also from a very anecdotal survey of Chinese people that I come in touch with, and my family and friends, the notion that Taiwan is a part of China is a very uncontroversial thing to say in China. It's a really uncontroversial thing to say in China, and I think we have to realize that. It doesn't mean that everyone thinks invasion is a good thing, and I wouldn't be able to say how many people think that there should be an invasion. Probably most people don't think that, but they do think that Taiwan belongs to China. And so I don't know if you would ever get a popular uprising to say, no, don't do that. The only thing I can think of is if, let's say, Beijing makes that step, and it's a really drawn-out, bloody invasion in the way that the Ukraine war has been. There's lots of social media footage, and we know how digital the Chinese are. A lot of social media footage of people who look like them, being killed by the People's Liberation Army. I think that could lead to some kind of popular notion, but I'm skeptical how much the UK could influence that. I do think, though, the UK in its language, doesn't have to be pushing away Chinese people, making very clear and very specific that you're talking about the government and the party, you're not talking about the people and the country and the history and the culture. That's very important to get public opinion on side, is my own view on that. Any other questions? Yeah, one at the back.
Hello, following on from that, with Russia's invasion of the Ukraine, the UK government were quick to classify Russia as an enemy, for obvious reasons, being part of NATO. If China did invade Taiwan, morally, should the UK government treat China the same way it did with Russia?
I think it's been made pretty clear to the Chinese regime that the West will respond with some pretty robust sanctions, and and also in defensive military terms. I mean, there are obviously various elements of strategic ambiguity around the defense and military guarantees that will be given, but I think you don't have to be a particularly skilled sleuth to read between the lines. And it's important that the West makes that that credible, because certainly there's been a lot of soul-searching since Russia's invasion of Ukraine about the many opportunities that perhaps there could have been to have enacted a more effective deterrence or a more proactive military response, certainly post-2014. So I think China has learnt from Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but so have we. And I think it is. These two security theatres are inextricably linked, and it was something that I think perhaps wasn't on the horizon when Russia crossed that border in February 22, but certainly the Ukraine question and how it pertains to the Taiwan question, they are extremely different scenarios, but I think what would be absolutely consistent is the use of a highly coordinated, robust sanctions regime, which has proven very effective in the Russia case, and I don't think China would be under any illusions that that would be applied.
Sam, what's more, given the parliamentary dynamic we've talked about, presumably the government would have to take very strong steps in reaction to that, not least because of backbench pressure.
Yeah, you would absolutely assume so. And I think, to build on Sophia's answer, that it's a really interesting question that you can imagine our government asking governments around the world. Because one of the things we saw with the invasion of Ukraine was people saying, every democracy stands against this invasion. And unfortunately, every democracy didn't stand against the invasion. That's not how geopolitics works. It's never that black and white. It's never that simple. And this is where the Australians have absolutely smashed it with the Foreign Minister Penny Wong. You go along to these countries and you say, look, we're in the same neck of the woods. What's your ideal outcome here? What do you want to see this develop like? And how can we help you achieve that? We're X-ranking power here, et cetera, et cetera. I think a lot of this stuff can get quite performative, which is fine. Politics is about performing. That's a good thing. But we need to be able to have these conversations. And as both Cindy and Sophia touched on there, it needs to be as a group, as much of a group as we can get together. So it's a really great question. And I hope it's a question that's been asked in embassies around the world right now from the Brits and our close friends too.
And just to round off with my personal thoughts on that question, which is that I think the operative difference is that Ukrainians look like Europeans and the Taiwanese don't. And Taiwan is much, much further from the UK than Ukraine is. So I can totally understand the very immediate and strong reaction that the West and the UK have given. I am interested to see whether that reaction would be similarly reflexive if a Taiwan invasion were to happen. And we already know the kind of the pro-Russian, or at least the Russian sympathetic viewpoint on Ukraine already in, for example, in America, saying that we shouldn't be helping Ukraine. I can only imagine those voices will be louder if it comes to Taiwan. So I think really interesting question here.